Welcome, dear wanderer, to another gentle journey through the forgotten corridors of history. As you settle into your most comfortable position tonight, whether nestled in your favourite armchair by a crackling fire or wrapped warmly in soft blankets, I invite you to share with me where in this vast world you're listening from and what time of evening it is in your corner of existence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. There's something deeply comforting about knowing our little community of midnight historians stretches across continents and time zones. Perhaps you're listening as rain patters against your window in London, or maybe the desert stars are twinkling above you in Arizona. Some of you might be welcoming the dawn in Sydney, while others are bidding farewell to another day in São Paulo. This invisible thread that connects us all through our shared love of history's quieter moments never fails to warm my heart. If you find solace in these meandering explorations through time's shadowed paths, if these whispered tales of bygone eras help ease you into peaceful slumber, I'd be truly honoured if you'd consider subscribing to join our growing family of curious souls. We're a gentle community of dreamers and thinkers, united by our fascination with the human stories that have shaped our world, seeking both knowledge and rest in equal measure. Tonight, we embark on a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about medieval warfare. The image of the noble knight, gleaming armour catching sunlight, colourful banners streaming in the wind, charging valiantly toward glory, has captivated our imaginations for centuries. But what if I told you that the real secret of knightly warfare wasn't their courage or their weapons, but their almost supernatural ability to survive battles that should have killed them all? This isn't a tale of honour and chivalry, but of desperate men employing shocking, ingenious, and often disturbing methods to stay alive when death stalked every shadow of the medieval battlefield. Our story unfolds in the mist-shrouded lands of Valdris, a kingdom nestled between the Thornwood Mountains and the Serpentine Sea, during the turbulent years of the Iron Crown Wars. Here, in this realm of stone castles and muddy battlefields, knights didn't just fight. They survived against impossible odds through methods that would astonish and perhaps horrify the modern mind. Picture, if you will, the autumn morning mists rolling across the fields of Ravensmoor, where two great armies faced each other in the year 1247. The clash that was about to unfold would become legendary not for its glory, but for the extraordinary lengths to which knights would go to see another sunset. What happened on that blood-soaked field would reveal survival techniques passed down through generations of warriors, secrets whispered in armories and practiced in the dark hours before dawn. As we prepare to delve into this world together, I want you to imagine the weight of 30 pounds of steel armour pressing down on a man's shoulders, the restricted vision through a narrow helmet slit, the suffocating heat building inside that metal shell. Now imagine that same man not only surviving the chaos of medieval combat, but employing tactics so cunning, so brutal, and so effective that they kept him breathing when hundreds around him perished. The Knights of Valdris weren't just warriors. They were survivors in the truest sense, men who understood that victory meant nothing if you weren't alive to enjoy it. They developed methods of battlefield survival that went far beyond swinging a sword or hiding behind a shield. These were psychological tactics, medical innovations, strategic deceptions, and survival techniques that bordered on the supernatural in their effectiveness. Tonight, we'll discover how Sir Gareth the Ironclad survived 13 major battles by perfecting the art of death mimicry, a terrifying technique that saved his life more than once. We'll learn about the mysterious blood brotherhood pacts that kept small groups of knights alive through mutual protection methods that sound more like magic than military strategy. We'll explore the underground network of battlefield medics who could keep a man fighting with wounds that should have been fatal, and the secret signals that allowed knights to coordinate survival tactics even in the chaos of melee combat. We'll uncover the truth about ghost knights, warriors so skilled at survival that they seem to vanish and reappear on battlefields like phantoms, leaving enemies confused and allies inspired. These weren't supernatural beings, but men who had mastered the art of battlefield psychology and environmental manipulation to such a degree that they became legends in their own lifetime. But perhaps most shocking of all, we'll learn about the dark pacts knights made with the enemy, agreements that ensured mutual survival even as they appeared to fight to the death. These weren't acts of cowardice, but calculated strategies that kept the flower of European knighthood alive through centuries of warfare that should have destroyed them utterly. As you let your breathing slow and your mind drift toward the peaceful realm of sleep, prepare yourself for a journey into a world where survival wasn't just about strength or skill, but about cunning, adaptation, and the desperate human will to live another day. This is the untold story of medieval knights, not as heroes or villains, but as the ultimate survivors in history's bloodiest era. So close your eyes, dear listener, and let us travel together to the fog-shrouded battlefields of ancient Valdris, where the clang of steel on steel mingles with the whispered secrets of men who refuse to die, no matter what horrors the medieval world threw at them. Tonight, we discover not how knights fought, but how they survived, and the extraordinary prices they paid for the privilege of seeing another dawn. Rest easy, knowing that ahead lies a tale of human ingenuity, desperate courage, and the incredible lengths to which people will go when survival itself becomes the ultimate victory. For centuries, we've been fed a magnificent lie about medieval warfare. In countless films, books, and tales, we see knights as noble warriors charging fearlessly into battle, their hearts pure, their cause just, their deaths glorious and meaningful. Hollywood shows us men who face death with stoic courage, who fall gracefully in service to king and country, who view survival as secondary to honour. But what if everything you believe about knightly courage is backwards? What if the greatest knights weren't the ones who died gloriously, but the ones who lived shamefully? What if the most celebrated warriors of the medieval period weren't heroes at all, but cunning survivors who would do absolutely anything, no matter how dishonourable, how brutal, or how shocking, to avoid death? Tonight, we shatter the pristine image of the chivalrous knight to reveal something far more fascinating and infinitely more human. We're about to discover that the knights who became legends weren't the bravest. They were the smartest. They weren't the most honourable. They were the most adaptable. And they certainly weren't the most noble. They were the most ruthlessly practical when it came to staying alive. The romantic notion of knightly warfare is perhaps history's most persistent fantasy. We imagine gleaming tournaments where noble gentlemen compete with grace and dignity. We picture battlefields where warriors face each other with mutual respect, where quarter is given to the defeated, where honour matters more than victory. We envision a world where knights died well, fighting valiantly for causes greater than themselves. This beautiful lie has been so thoroughly embedded in our cultural consciousness that we've forgotten to ask the most obvious question. If medieval battles were so deadly, and if knights fought with such reckless courage, how did anyone survive long enough to become legendary? How did men like Sir Gareth the Ironclad fight in 13 major battles spanning 23 years? How did Sir Aldrich of Blackmoor accumulate enough wealth and reputation to found 3 castles if he was constantly throwing his life away for honour? The answer is as simple as it is shocking. They didn't fight the way we think they did. They didn't die gloriously because they were utterly committed to not dying at all. Every single technique they developed, every strategy they employed, every innovation they created was designed with one primary goal: survival at any cost. Consider this. The average knight's career in Valdris lasted approximately 15 years. In those 15 years, a successful knight might participate in dozens of battles, hundreds of skirmishes, and countless raids. The mathematical probability of surviving this many violent encounters through courage alone approaches 0. Yet survive they did, in remarkable numbers, accumulating wealth, reputation, and power that would be impossible for dead heroes. What we're about to explore together isn't the story of brave men facing death with dignity. It's the story of clever men who turned cowardice into an art form, who transformed dishonour into survival strategy, who discovered that living to fight another day required techniques that would make modern special forces soldiers blush with embarrassment. The knights of medieval Valdris developed what they called the Serpent's Path, a philosophy of warfare that prioritised cunning over courage, survival over honour, and practical victory over glorious defeat. This wasn't a formal code written in books or proclaimed in great halls. It was a whispered tradition, passed from grizzled veteran to eager squire in the dark hours before battle, shared in the bloody aftermath of combat, refined through generations of men who understood that dead heroes were just dead. We're going to discover survival techniques so effective that they kept men alive through decades of the most brutal warfare in human history. We'll learn about psychological manipulation tactics that could turn a disadvantageous battle into a survival opportunity. We'll explore medical innovations that sound more like dark magic than battlefield medicine. We'll uncover deception strategies that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. But perhaps most disturbing of all, we'll reveal the social networks that allowed knights to survive through mutual betrayal, the economic systems that rewarded cowardice over courage, and the cultural blind spots that allowed the most successful survivors to be remembered as the greatest heroes. The knights you're about to meet weren't the knights of legend. They were something far more interesting. They were humans pushed to their absolute limits, forced to choose between the honor that would kill them and the pragmatism that would keep them breathing. And when faced with that choice, again and again, they chose life over glory in ways that would horrify their own troubadours. This isn't a tale of heroes and villains. It's a tale of survivors and corpses, of men who understood that in a world designed to kill them, the greatest victory wasn't conquest. It was simply opening your eyes the next morning. As we prepare to follow these survivors into the fog of medieval warfare, remember this. Everything you think you know about knightly combat is about to be turned upside down. The techniques we'll explore were hidden for good reason. They reveal not the nobility of medieval warfare, but its desperate, cunning, utterly human reality. So rest your head comfortably, dear listener, and prepare to discover the greatest secret of medieval knighthood. It wasn't about how to die well, but how to live when everyone around you was trying to kill you. The kingdom of Valdres emerged from the ashes of the old Draconian Empire in the year 1156, when the last Emperor Maximus fell at the Battle of Crimson Fields. What rose in its place wasn't the orderly succession of power that historians often describe, but a chaotic patchwork of competing lordships, each claiming legitimacy, each desperately trying to carve out territory in a world where yesterday's allies became tomorrow's enemies with the changing of the seasons. The geography of Valdres itself shaped the brutal nature of its warfare. Sandwiched between the impassable Thornwood Mountains to the north and the treacherous Serpentine Sea to the south, the kingdom was essentially a narrow corridor of fertile land that every ambitious warlord coveted. The Thornwood Mountains weren't just a natural barrier, they were home to the wild clans, savage tribal warriors who would periodically sweep down from their mountain fortresses to raid the lowlands, adding another layer of chaos to an already unstable region. To the east lay the Ashen Wastes, a desolate expanse where ancient battles had supposedly poisoned the very soil, making it unsuitable for farming, but perfect for hiding armies and staging surprise attacks. The western border was marked by the River Blood Run, so named not for any single battle, but for the countless skirmishes that had stained its waters red over the decades. This river was both a blessing and a curse. It provided fresh water and trade routes, but its many fords and crossing points made the kingdom vulnerable to invasion from the neighbouring realm of Corthine. It was in this pressure cooker of geography and politics that the unique warrior culture of Valdres was forged. Unlike the stable kingdoms to the south, where knights could expect long periods of peace interrupted by occasional campaigns, Valdrian knights lived in a state of constant low-level warfare. A knight might wake up to defend against a wild clan raid, spend his afternoon pursuing bandits through the Thornwood foothills, and end his day helping to repel a river crossing by Cothane forces. This relentless tempo of violence created an entirely different breed of warrior than existed anywhere else in the medieval world. Where other kingdoms could afford the luxury of chivalric ideals and elaborate codes of honour, Valdrian knights developed what military historians would later call adaptive survivalism, a practical philosophy of warfare that prioritised staying alive over looking honourable. The feudal system in Valdres reflected this harsh reality. Traditional European feudalism was built around land grants in exchange for military service, with clear hierarchies and established obligations. But in Valdres, where territory changed hands with disturbing frequency, and traditional authority structures collapsed regularly, the feudal system evolved into something much more fluid and pragmatic. Lords in Valdres didn't grant land, they granted survival partnerships. A typical arrangement might involve a lord providing a knight with armour, weapons, and a war horse, while the knight pledged not just military service, but what they called blood brotherhood, a commitment to keep the lord alive through whatever means necessary, even if it meant abandoning traditional battle formations or retreating when honour demanded a fight. These survival partnerships created tight-knit military units that functioned more like special operations teams than traditional knightly companies. A typical Valdrian brotherhood consisted of 5 to 8 knights who had sworn binding oaths not just to fight together, but to survive together. They developed specialized roles within their group: the Ghost, who specialized in battlefield reconnaissance and escape routes; the Healer, who combined medical knowledge with tactical awareness; the Deceiver, who mastered psychological warfare and enemy manipulation; and the Anchor, who served as the group's tactical center and decision-maker under pressure. Training for Valdrian knights began earlier and lasted longer than anywhere else in the medieval world. Boys as young as 5 were taken from their families and placed in what were called survival schools, brutal training camps hidden in the Thornwood foothills, where they learned not just traditional martial skills, but the desperate arts of staying alive in impossible situations. These schools taught skills that would have horrified knights from more civilized kingdoms. Students learned how to fake their own deaths convincingly enough to fool enemy soldiers searching battlefields for survivors. They practiced emergency field medicine that could keep a man conscious, and fighting with wounds that should have been incapacitating. They studied enemy psychology, learning to read facial expressions and body language to predict attacks or identify opportunities for escape. Perhaps most controversially, they learned what instructors called tactical cowardice, the art of strategic retreat, calculated surrender, and temporary alliance with enemies when survival demanded it. Students were taught that there was no shame in running from a battle you couldn't win, no dishonor in surrendering to an enemy who might let you live, and no betrayal in switching sides temporarily if it meant you could return to fight for your true cause another day. The weapons and armor of Valdrian knights reflected their survival-focused philosophy. While knights in other kingdoms competed to display their wealth through elaborate decoration and impressive size, Valdrian equipment was designed for one purpose: keeping the wearer alive. Their armor was lighter but more strategically positioned, protecting vital organs while maintaining mobility. Their weapons were selected not for their impressiveness in tournaments, but for their effectiveness in the chaotic close-quarters combat that characterized Valdrian warfare. Most distinctively, every Valdrian knight carried what they called a survival kit, a carefully curated collection of tools and supplies designed to keep them alive in emergency situations. These kits included everything from medical supplies and emergency food to lockpicks, disguise materials, and even small amounts of precious metals that could be used for bribes or ransom payments. This practical approach to knightly equipment extended to their horses as well. While other kingdoms prized massive destriers that could carry heavily armoured knights in glorious charges, Valdrian knights preferred smaller, more agile mounts that could navigate difficult terrain quickly and quietly. These horses were trained not just for battle, but for escape. They could carry their riders away from losing battles, navigate mountain paths at night, and even swim across rivers when traditional bridges became too dangerous to use. The result of this systematic approach to survival was a knightly culture unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Valdrian knights weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were professionals who had turned warfare into a science and survival into an art form. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the grey dawn light of autumn 1251, a young page named Cassius Thornfield knelt in the muddy courtyard of Ravenshollow Keep, about to witness something that would change his understanding of knighthood forever. He had been selected to serve Sir Gareth the Ironclad, a knight whose reputation for surviving impossible battles had reached almost mythical proportions. What Cassius didn't realise was that he was about to become apprenticed to the most cunning battlefield survivor in all of Valdris. Gareth wasn't born to nobility. His father had been a blacksmith in the border town of Millhaven, and his mother a tavern keeper who could patch wounds as skillfully as she could pour ale. When Wild Clan raiders burned Millhaven to the ground in 1228, 8-year-old Gareth had survived by hiding in the forge's coal pile, breathing through a hollow reed while warriors searched for survivors to enslave. That early lesson in the value of concealment over confrontation would shape everything that followed. Found 3 days later by Valdrian knights tracking the raiders, young Gareth was taken to serve as a page in the household of Lord Marcus Grimwald. Unlike most noble children who entered knightly training, Gareth brought with him a visceral understanding of what it meant to face death, and more importantly what it meant to choose survival over heroics. The other pages mocked his common birth and his tendency to avoid unnecessary fights, but the Master-at-Arms, Sir Brennan the Scarred, recognized something valuable in the boy's instinctive caution. Gareth's early training was unremarkable except for one thing. He never lost a sparring match, not because he was the strongest or fastest, but because he fought to avoid injury rather than to inflict it. While other pages threw themselves into combat with reckless abandon, Gareth developed what his instructors came to call defensive aggression, a fighting style that prioritized neutralizing threats while preserving his own capacity to continue fighting. His first real test came at age 16 during a Wild Clan raid on the outlying village of Thornbridge. The raiders had trapped a group of villagers in the local chapel and were preparing to burn it down when Gareth and a small company of knights arrived. Traditional knightly tactics would have called for a direct charge to scatter the raiders and rescue the villagers. Instead, Gareth convinced his commanding officer to try something different. Rather than charging openly, Gareth had observed that the raiders were nervous about potential reinforcements and kept looking toward the main road. He suggested that half the knights create noise and movement visible from the chapel, while he and 2 others approached from the blind side of the building. When the main group retreated in apparent panic, the raiders abandoned their positions to pursue what they thought was a defeated enemy, allowing Gareth's team to free the villagers and escape through the chapel's back entrance. The tactic worked perfectly. The villagers were saved, no knights were injured, and the raiders eventually gave up their pursuit when they realized they'd been deceived. But when the group returned to Ravenshollow Keep, Gareth faced harsh criticism from some of the older knights, who felt his deception violated the principles of honourable combat. This early controversy taught him a crucial lesson. Survival techniques that worked on the battlefield would need to be carefully managed in the political environment of knightly society. Gareth's knighting ceremony in 1247 was deliberately modest. He specifically requested that it be held privately, rather than as a grand public celebration. He had already learned that the most effective survivors were often those who drew the least attention to themselves. While other newly made knights competed for prestigious assignments that might win them glory, Gareth actively sought out the dangerous, thankless missions that veteran knights preferred to avoid. It was during the siege of Blackwater Tower that Gareth first employed what would become his signature survival technique: tactical death mimicry. The siege had gone badly for the Valdrian forces, and during a failed assault on the tower's walls, Gareth found himself separated from his unit and surrounded by enemy soldiers. Rather than fighting his way out, a virtually impossible task, he allowed himself to fall among a pile of corpses and remained motionless for nearly 6 hours, while enemy soldiers stripped armour and weapons from the dead. The technique required extraordinary mental discipline. Gareth had to control his breathing to an almost supernatural degree, remain completely still despite cramping muscles and insects crawling across his face, and resist the natural impulse to move when enemy soldiers stepped on him or moved his limbs while searching for valuables. Most challenging of all, he had to overcome the psychological horror of lying among genuinely dead men, feeling their cooling flesh pressed against his own skin. When darkness finally fell, Gareth crept away from the corpse pile and spent 3 days making his way back to Valdrian lines through enemy territory. He travelled only at night, sustained himself by eating roots and berries he'd learned to identify during his childhood survival training, and avoided detection by sleeping in caves and hollow logs during daylight hours. When he finally stumbled into a Valdrian camp, filthy and exhausted, his fellow knights initially mistook him for an enemy spy. But Gareth's survival wasn't just a personal victory. He brought with him detailed intelligence about enemy positions, weapon placements, and supply lines that he'd observed during his escape. This information proved invaluable in planning the successful second assault that eventually captured Blackwater Tower. Word of his accomplishment spread quietly through the Valdrian military, and commanders began to recognise that Gareth's unconventional methods produced results that traditional heroics couldn't match. Over the following years, Gareth refined his survival techniques through careful observation and methodical practice. He studied the behaviour of genuinely wounded men so he could mimic their movements and sounds when necessary. He learned to control his pulse and breathing so effectively that he could appear dead even to experienced battlefield medics. He memorised the locations of caves, ruins, and other hiding places throughout Valdris territory, creating a mental map of safe havens he could reach from any major battlefield. More importantly, Gareth began training other knights in modified versions of his techniques. He couldn't openly teach tactical death mimicry, Such explicit deception would have been considered dishonourable by military leadership, but he could share emergency concealment procedures and battlefield medical techniques that accomplished similar goals through more acceptable language. By 1251, when young Cassius Thornfield became his page, Gareth had transformed from a common-born survivor into the unofficial master of an entirely new approach to knightly warfare. His methods had kept him alive through 13 major battles, dozens of skirmishes, and countless dangerous missions. More importantly, they had kept alive the men who served under his command, earning him a loyalty that went far beyond normal military hierarchy. But Gareth's greatest innovation was still to come, the development of the survival brotherhood network that would revolutionize how Valdrian knights approached the deadly art of staying alive in a world designed to kill them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the armoury at Ravenshollow Keep as master weaponsmith. Henrik Ironforge began his daily ritual of equipment inspection. What most observers saw was a craftsman maintaining weapons and armour, but Henrik was actually conducting something far more complex, a methodical analysis of survival technology that had been refined through decades of battlefield testing and corpse examination. Henrik wasn't just any blacksmith. He was a former knight who had lost his sword arm at the Battle of Thornfield Pass and subsequently dedicated his life to understanding why some men lived while others died. His workshop had become the unofficial research centre for Valdrian survival technology, where every piece of equipment was designed not for appearance or tradition, but for the singular purpose of keeping its user breathing. The armour produced in Henrik's forge bore little resemblance to the elaborate suits worn by knights in more civilised kingdoms. Where other armourers focused on complete coverage and impressive aesthetics, Henrik had identified the precise balance between protection and mobility that maximised survival probability. His detailed analysis of battlefield casualties had revealed that knights died most commonly from wounds to 5 specific areas: the neck, inner thighs, armpits, lower back, and ankles. Consequently, every piece of Valdrian armour featured enhanced protection for these vulnerable points while maintaining minimal weight and maximum flexibility elsewhere. Henrik's helmets were perhaps his most innovative creation. Traditional great helms provided excellent protection but severely limited vision and hearing, 2 senses that often meant the difference between life and death in chaotic battlefield conditions. His designs featured carefully angled viewing slits that provided nearly 180-degree vision while maintaining structural integrity, and subtle sound channels that allowed wearers to hear approaching threats without compromising head protection. Most remarkably, each helmet included what Henrik called emergency release mechanisms, hidden latches that allowed a knight to shed his helmet instantly if it became damaged, or if he needed to assume a non-threatening appearance quickly. The cost of producing such specialised equipment was staggering. A complete suit of Henrik's survival armour required approximately 14 months to manufacture and cost the equivalent of a prosperous farm's annual income. The exotic metals required for optimal weight-to-protection ratios had to be imported from distant kingdoms, often through dangerous trade routes that increased costs exponentially. The specialised tools needed for precision work represented investments that bankrupted lesser armourers who attempted to copy Henrik's techniques. But the hidden costs went far beyond materials and labour. Each piece of Valdrian survival equipment incorporated what Henrik privately called blood knowledge, information derived from examining the bodies of knights who had died in specific ways, understanding exactly how a sword thrust penetrated between armour plates, or precisely what angle of impact caused fatal head trauma, required Henrik to spend considerable time studying fresh corpses and interviewing dying knights about their experiences. This morbid research had psychological consequences that extended throughout the entire supply chain. Apprentice armourers who worked with Henrik often suffered from nightmares and developed lasting fears about their own mortality. The detailed casualty reports that informed armour design decisions were so disturbing that Henrik eventually limited access to them, recognising that excessive exposure to such material was damaging the mental health of his craftsmen. Weapon development followed similar principles of ruthless practicality. Traditional knightly swords were designed for honour combat, formal duels where rules governed engagement and single combat was expected. Valdrian weapons were designed for survival in chaotic melees where multiple opponents, poor visibility and unpredictable terrain created entirely different tactical requirements. Henrik's signature creation was what he called the Serpent Blade, a sword with subtle modifications that made it devastatingly effective in close-quarter survival fighting. The blade featured a slight curve that allowed it to slide around enemy shields more easily, while microscopic serrations along the cutting edge created wounds that bled more profusely, potentially incapacitating opponents faster. The crossguard incorporated small spikes that could be used for gouging in grappling situations, and the pommel was weighted to serve as an effective club when sword techniques became impractical. More controversially, Henrik also produced what he euphemistically called emergency tools, devices that served legitimate battlefield functions but could also be used for activities that fell outside traditional codes of honourable combat. These included lockpicks disguised as armour maintenance tools, small vials of substances that could induce temporary illness when consumed, and even devices designed to create convincing fake wounds for deception purposes. The economic implications of this survival-focused equipment extended far beyond individual knights and their families. The specialised nature of Valdrian military technology created a thriving underground economy of craftsmen, suppliers and traders who catered specifically to survival needs. Merchants who dealt in emergency medical supplies, specialised foods that could sustain a knight during extended hiding periods, and even services like wound makeup and concealment techniques found profitable markets among knights who understood that their lives might depend on such preparations. The maintenance requirements for survival equipment were equally demanding. Traditional knightly armour could be maintained by relatively unskilled servants using basic tools and techniques. Henrik's creations required constant attention from trained specialists who understood the complex mechanisms and delicate balances that made the equipment effective. A knight using survival gear needed to employ a small team of maintenance specialists, driving up the ongoing costs of knightly service significantly. Perhaps most expensive of all were the horses required for Valdrian knights' survival tactics. Traditional destriers were bred for size, strength and intimidating presence, qualities that made them effective in formal cavalry charges, but problematic for the quick escapes and stealthy movement that characterized Valdrian warfare. Henrik worked closely with specialized horse breeders to develop animals that combined the strength needed to carry a fully equipped knight with the agility required for rapid terrain navigation and the intelligence needed to respond to complex commands in high-stress situations. These survival horses represented investments that dwarfed even the cost of armour and weapons. A properly trained Valdrian warhorse required 4 years of specialised conditioning and cost more than most knights could earn in a decade of military service. The training process itself was dangerous. Many horses were injured or killed while learning to navigate difficult terrain at speed or to remain calm during simulated battlefield conditions. The economic burden of equipping a single Valdrian knight for survival warfare was so enormous that it fundamentally changed the social structure of knighthood in the kingdom. Unlike other regions where individual knights could outfit themselves through personal wealth or family resources, Valdrian knights required systematic financial backing from lords who understood the long-term value of keeping experienced warriors alive. This created a form of military investment capitalism where lords competed to sponsor the most effective survival knights, expecting returns in the form of successful missions, captured territory, and enhanced military reputation. Knights, in turn, became valuable assets whose survival was too important to risk in traditional glory-seeking adventures. The result was a military culture where equipment wasn't just armour and weapons. It was a comprehensive survival system that represented the accumulated knowledge of generations of men who had faced death and chosen to live instead. The morning of the Battle of Thornfield Pass dawned with an eerie crimson sky that veteran knights recognised as an omen of extraordinary bloodshed to come. Sir Gareth the Ironclad stood with his survival brotherhood at the edge of the Valdrian camp, watching enemy banners emerge from the morning mist like spectres materialising from nightmare. What was about to unfold would shatter every romantic notion about medieval combat and reveal the true horror that survival-focused knights faced every time they entered battle. The enemy force approaching across Thornfield Pass was unlike anything the Valdrian knights had previously encountered. The Corthine army included not just traditional heavy cavalry and infantry, but specialised units trained specifically to counter Valdrian survival tactics. Intelligence reports suggested that Corthine commanders had been studying Valdrian battlefield behaviour for months, developing counter-strategies designed to turn the kingdom's greatest military advantages into fatal weaknesses. As the two armies formed their battle lines, the sensory assault began even before the first weapon was drawn. The sound of thousands of men in armour moving across rocky terrain created a constant metallic grinding that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Horses stamped and snorted nervously, their breath creating clouds of vapour in the cold morning air. The smell of unwashed bodies, leather, and metal mixed with the acrid smoke from cooking fires being hastily extinguished as both sides prepared for combat. Sir Gareth's Brotherhood had spent the previous night implementing their pre-battle survival protocols, procedures that would have horrified knights from more traditional kingdoms. Each member had carefully memorised multiple escape routes from the battlefield, identifying terrain features that could provide concealment and marking the locations of caves, ravines, and other potential hiding places. They had established rally points where survivors could regroup after the battle, and had even cached emergency supplies at strategic locations around the battlefield. Most disturbing of all, they had drawn lots to determine who would be designated as the witness, the Brotherhood member whose primary responsibility was to survive the battle, regardless of what happened to his companions, so that their families could learn their fate and their tactical innovations could be preserved for future knights. Today, that burden fell to Sir Marcus Blackwood, the youngest member of their group, who would carry the psychological weight of prioritising his own survival over his brothers' lives. When the battle horns finally sounded, the reality of medieval combat revealed itself in all its chaotic brutality. The initial cavalry charge that began the engagement looked nothing like the organised formations depicted in romantic paintings. Instead, it was a thunderous collision of flesh, metal, and animal panic that created an immediate killing ground of fallen horses, screaming men, and splintered weapons. The noise was beyond anything that modern minds can easily comprehend. The impact of lance against shield produced sounds like trees being split by lightning, while the screams of wounded horses created an otherworldly shrieking that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Men shouted orders that couldn't be heard above the din, while the clash of metal on metal created a constant ringing that left many knights partially deaf for days after battle. Visual conditions were equally nightmarish. Dust kicked up by thousands of hooves and feet created a choking cloud that reduced visibility to mere yards, while the narrow eye slits of combat helmets further restricted vision. Knights found themselves swinging weapons at shadows and shapes that might be enemies, allies, or riderless horses. The psychological pressure of fighting blind while surrounded by the sounds of death was so intense that many experienced warriors simply froze in place, overwhelmed by sensory overload. Sir Gareth's survival training proved its value within minutes of the initial engagement. While other knights became disoriented by the chaos, his methodical preparation allowed him to maintain tactical awareness even in the midst of the melee. He had trained extensively to fight while maintaining mental maps of his surroundings, using sound and peripheral vision to track threats and opportunities that other knights missed entirely. The first test of Valdrian survival philosophy came when Sir Gareth found himself facing 3 Corthane knights simultaneously, a situation where traditional honour would have demanded that he fight to the death rather than seek escape. Instead, he employed what his brotherhood called tactical submission, allowing himself to be knocked from his horse and falling among the bodies of men and animals already littering the battlefield. The experience of lying motionless among genuine corpses while enemy soldiers stepped over and around him was psychologically devastating. The weight of a dead horse pinned his left leg, while the blood from a mortally wounded knight slowly soaked through his armour. Flies began settling on the bodies around him within minutes, and the stench of death mixed with the metallic taste of blood created a sensory assault that tested the limits of human endurance. But perhaps most horrifying was the sound of wounded men dying slowly around him. Knights who'd been struck down but not killed immediately lay groaning and calling for help that would never come. Some begged for water, others for their mothers, while a few simply sobbed quietly as they felt their lives bleeding away into the churned mud of the battlefield. Sir Gareth was forced to listen to these death agonies while remaining completely motionless, knowing that any movement might reveal his deception and result in his own death. The psychological techniques required to maintain this deception pushed human mental resilience to its absolute limits. Gareth had to simultaneously suppress his natural empathy for the dying men around him, control his physical responses to increasingly disturbing stimuli, and maintain the mental discipline necessary to track enemy movements and plan his eventual escape. The training required to develop such psychological control had taken years of gradual conditioning that hardened knights' minds in ways that fundamentally changed their humanity. When enemy soldiers began systematically checking bodies for survivors, Sir Gareth faced the ultimate test of his death mimicry skills. Corthane troops had been specifically trained to detect Valdrian survival deceptions, using techniques that included checking for breath, testing muscle tension, and even inflicting minor wounds to provoke involuntary responses. Gareth endured having his eyelids forcibly opened while remaining completely motionless, felt enemy hands checking for pulse points on his neck and wrists, and even suffered a shallow knife cut across his forearm without flinching. The mental toll of such experiences was catastrophic. Knights who survived battlefield deceptions often suffered from what Henrik Ironforge privately documented as corpse madness, a condition that included persistent nightmares, inability to tolerate the smell of blood or decay, and episodes of complete emotional numbness that could last for months. Many survival knights developed compulsive behaviours related to cleanliness and hygiene, desperately trying to wash away memories that had been seared into their consciousness. Yet despite these psychological costs, the survival techniques worked with devastating effectiveness. While traditional knights died in glorious charges that accomplished nothing beyond feeding carrion birds, survival-focused warriors like Sir Gareth lived to fight another day, accumulating experience and tactical knowledge that made them increasingly valuable military assets. The true horror of Thornfield Pass wasn't the death toll. It was the realization that survival in medieval warfare required men to abandon their humanity piece by piece, trading compassion for cunning and honour for the desperate pragmatism of staying alive in a world designed to kill them. In the aftermath of Thornfield Pass, as the crows began their grim feast and the moans of the dying echoed across the blood-soaked field, Sir Gareth the Ironclad faced a reality that no amount of survival training could have prepared him for. 3 members of his brotherhood lay among the genuine dead, and the psychological burden of witnessing their deaths while maintaining his deception would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The immediate aftermath of medieval battles created survival challenges that extended far beyond the combat itself. Knights who had successfully employed deception techniques to avoid death during the fighting now faced the equally dangerous task of escaping enemy-controlled territory while wounded, disoriented, and psychologically traumatized. The hours immediately following a battle were often more deadly than the combat itself, as surviving knights became vulnerable to enemy patrols, scavenging locals and their own accumulated injuries. Sir Gareth's escape from Thornfield Pass required him to remain motionless among the corpses for nearly 8 hours after the fighting ended. During this time, he was forced to listen as enemy soldiers moved through the battlefield, finishing off wounded Valdrian knights with methodical efficiency. The Corthine forces had been specifically instructed to take no prisoners, and their systematic execution of survivors created a soundscape of pleading voices that gradually fell silent one by one. The psychological impact of witnessing these executions while being unable to intervene fundamentally changed Sir Gareth's understanding of his survival philosophy. Each death he witnessed while maintaining his deception added another layer of guilt to the burden he carried, but moving to help would have meant certain death for himself without saving his dying comrades. This impossible moral calculus, choosing personal survival over the lives of fellow knights, was the hidden cost of Valdrian survival techniques that was never discussed in training, but became the defining trauma of every knight who employed them successfully. When darkness finally fell and enemy patrols withdrew to their camp, Sir Gareth began the agonizing process of extricating himself from the corpse pile. His left leg had been pinned under a dead warhorse for so long that circulation had been severely compromised, leaving him with painful cramping and limited mobility. His armour had been penetrated by the slow seepage of blood and other bodily fluids from the surrounding corpses, creating infection risks that could prove fatal even if he successfully escaped the immediate area. The journey back to Valdrian territory took Sir Gareth 6 days of careful movement through hostile countryside. His survival training had included extensive instruction in wilderness navigation, foraging, and concealment, but the practical reality of implementing these skills while injured and traumatized proved far more difficult than any training exercise had suggested. He was forced to travel only at night, spending daylight hours hidden in caves, abandoned buildings, or dense forest undergrowth where enemy patrols were unlikely to search. Sustaining himself during this escape required techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. With no access to normal food sources, Sir Gareth was forced to eat whatever he could find: tree bark, roots, insects, and on one occasion, meat scavenged from a wolf-killed deer that had been partially consumed by scavengers. The psychological degradation of surviving on such fare, combined with the constant fear of discovery, created a mental state that bordered on complete breakdown. Perhaps most challenging was the need to treat his own injuries without proper medical supplies or assistance. The shallow knife wound inflicted during the enemy's survivor check had become infected, creating a constant burning pain that made concentration difficult. More seriously, his prolonged immobility among the corpses had resulted in severe muscle cramping and joint stiffness that limited his mobility and made quiet movement nearly impossible. Using techniques learned from battlefield medics, Sir Gareth was forced to perform crude medical procedures on himself using improvised tools. He cleaned his infected wound with water that had been boiled over carefully concealed fires, packed it with moss that he hoped would absorb drainage and prevent further infection, and bound it with strips torn from his undergarments. The pain of these self-administered treatments, performed without anesthesia or proper instruments, was excruciating, but infection could prove fatal if left untreated. The psychological consequences of his escape began manifesting before Sir Gareth even reached safety. He developed an obsessive need to constantly check his surroundings for threats, making sleep nearly impossible even when hidden in secure locations. The sound of wind through trees became the approach of enemy patrols, while normal forest sounds transformed into evidence of pursuit. His mind, traumatized by hours of lying among corpses and witnessing executions, began creating threats where none existed. Most disturbing was the development of what military physicians would later recognize as survivor's guilt syndrome. Sir Gareth found himself compulsively reliving the deaths of his Brotherhood members, imagining alternative scenarios where he might have saved them, and questioning whether his survival justified the cost in other men's lives. These mental loops became so persistent that they interfered with his ability to make rational decisions about navigation and concealment, nearly resulting in his capture on multiple occasions. When Sir Gareth finally stumbled into a Valdrian outpost on the 6th day after the battle, his physical appearance shocked even veterans who had seen the aftermath of numerous defeats. He had lost nearly 20 pounds during his escape. His face was gaunt and hollow-eyed, and his armour hung loose on a frame that seemed to have aged years in less than a week. But the psychological changes were even more dramatic. The confident, methodical knight who had entered the Battle of Thornfield Pass had been replaced by a haunted figure who flinched at sudden movements and spoke in whispers even when safe. The intelligence Sir Gareth brought back from his experience proved invaluable to Valdrian military planners, but the personal cost of acquiring that information was devastating. His detailed observations of Corthan tactics, troop movements, and anti-survival countermeasures helped prevent similar disasters in future engagements, but the knowledge came at the price of psychological damage that would never fully heal. Military physicians who examined returning survival knights began documenting patterns of long-term mental deterioration that they called corpse sickness. Knights who had successfully employed death mimicry techniques often developed persistent nightmares, extreme aversion to confined spaces, and episodes of complete emotional numbness that could last for weeks. Some became unable to tolerate the sight or smell of blood, making future battlefield service impossible, despite their valuable experience and training. The economic implications of these psychological casualties were significant, but largely hidden from public view. Knights suffering from corpse sickness required extended medical care, often involving expensive treatments by specialized physicians who understood battlefield trauma. Many were unable to return to active military service, representing substantial losses of investment in training and equipment. Some required lifetime pensions or care, creating financial burdens that lords were reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The social costs were equally devastating, but even more carefully concealed. Knights returning from survival operations often found themselves unable to maintain normal relationships with family members who couldn't understand their psychological changes. Many became isolated and withdrawn, unable to explain experiences that sounded like elaborate lies to those who hadn't witnessed the realities of survival warfare. Sir Gareth's return to Ravenshollow Keep marked the beginning of a new phase in Valdrian survival doctrine, one that would have to account for the long-term psychological costs of keeping knights alive in an increasingly brutal world. The Great Hall of Raven's Hollow Keep had always been adorned with tapestries depicting the glorious deeds of Valdrian knights, heroic charges, noble rescues, and chivalrous victories that inspired young men to seek knightly glory. But in the winter of 1252, following the disaster at Thornfield Pass, these romantic images began to feel like cruel mockeries to the knights who knew the brutal truth of survival warfare. The chivalric code that governed knightly behaviour throughout medieval Europe was built upon ideals that sounded magnificent when proclaimed by court poets. Courage in the face of death, protection of the innocent, loyalty to one's lord, and honourable conduct toward enemies. These principles were supposedly the foundation of knightly virtue, the moral framework that elevated warriors above mere killers and justified their privileged position in society. Yet every successful survival technique employed by Valdrian knights represented a systematic violation of these sacred principles. The tactical death mimicry that had saved Sir Gareth's life was fundamentally an act of deception, lying to enemies about one's condition in order to gain advantage. The blood brotherhood pacts that kept small groups of knights alive required them to prioritise their companions' survival over their duties to their lords. The emergency retreat protocols that preserved experienced warriors for future battles directly contradicted the chivalric expectation that knights should die gloriously rather than flee dishonourably. This growing contradiction between stated ideals and practical survival created a crisis of identity within Valdrian knightly culture that extended far beyond individual psychological trauma. Knights who had been raised to believe in the nobility of their calling found themselves employing tactics that their own moral education had taught them to despise. The cognitive dissonance of surviving through methods they had been taught to consider dishonourable created lasting psychological damage that went beyond the immediate trauma of battlefield experience. The case of Sir Aldrich of Blackmore exemplified this ideological breakdown in its most extreme form. Aldrich had been born into one of Valdris's most noble families, raised from childhood on stories of his ancestors' glorious deaths in service to the crown. His early training had emphasised traditional chivalric values so thoroughly that he initially refused to learn survival techniques, considering them beneath the dignity of a true knight. But the brutal realities of Valdrian warfare had a way of eroding even the most firmly held convictions. During the siege of Greystone Castle, Aldrich witnessed the systematic massacre of knights who adhered to traditional codes of honour, while survival-focused warriors lived to continue fighting. The sight of his childhood friend Sir Roland Whitehorse dying slowly from preventable wounds because he had refused to employ dishonourable medical deceptions that might have saved his life finally convinced Aldrich to abandon his idealistic principles. The transformation was devastating to witness. Aldrich's adoption of survival techniques was accompanied by a complete personality change that horrified those who had known him before. The young knight who had once quoted poetry about noble sacrifice became coldly calculating in his approach to warfare, viewing every engagement through the lens of personal survival, probability rather than honour or duty. Most disturbing was Aldrich's development of what observers called tactical sociopathy, the ability to completely suppress empathy and moral consideration when survival was at stake. During the Battle of Ravenscroft, Aldrich had deliberately misdirected enemy forces toward a group of Valdrian peasant conscripts, knowing they would be slaughtered in order to create a distraction that allowed his survival brotherhood to escape. When confronted about this decision afterward, he showed no remorse, arguing that the peasants were going to die anyway, and their deaths at least served a tactical purpose. The institutional response to this moral degradation revealed the extent to which Valdrian military leadership had quietly abandoned traditional chivalric principles in favour of practical effectiveness. Rather than condemning knights like Aldrich for their tactical sociopathy, commanders began systematically promoting them to leadership positions where their survival-focused mindset could influence broader military strategy. This created a feedback loop that accelerated the breakdown of traditional knightly culture. As survival-focused knights rose to positions of authority, they implemented training programs and operational procedures that further normalized the abandonment of chivalric ideals. New knights entering the system were taught from the beginning that survival trumped honor, that deception was preferable to glory, and that the only meaningful measure of knightly virtue was staying alive long enough to be effective. Religious institutions, which had traditionally provided moral guidance to knights through chaplains and confessors, found themselves in an impossible position. The techniques that kept knights alive often involved actions that traditional Christian morality condemned as sinful: lying, abandoning comrades, prioritizing self-preservation over service to others. Yet these same techniques were increasingly necessary for military effectiveness and personal survival. Some religious authorities attempted to develop new theological frameworks that could accommodate survival tactics within Christian moral teaching. These efforts produced increasingly convoluted justifications that argued deception in warfare was acceptable if it served a greater good, or that preserving one's life was actually a form of stewardship that honoured God's gift of existence. But these theological gymnastics convinced few people and only highlighted the fundamental incompatibility between traditional moral teaching and practical survival requirements. The result was a gradual secularization of knightly culture, as religious considerations became subordinated to practical effectiveness. Knights who had once prayed before battle for strength to die well began praying for cunning to live well. The rituals and ceremonies that had traditionally emphasized spiritual preparation for death were modified to focus on mental preparation for survival. This ideological transformation fundamentally altered the social contract between knights and the society they served. The traditional justification for knightly privilege, that knights deserved elevated status because they risked their lives for others, became hollow when knights primarily focused on preserving their own lives. Yet society had become dependent on these survival-focused warriors for military protection, creating a paradox that no one wanted to acknowledge openly. The chivalric ideal hadn't simply evolved, it had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something entirely different, leaving a generation of knights adrift in a moral landscape that offered no clear guidance for navigating the impossible choices that survival warfare demanded. The winter of 1253 brought news that struck terror into the hearts of even the most hardened Valdrian knights. The Crimson Brotherhood had crossed the Serpentine Sea and established a beachhead on Valdrian soil. This wasn't merely another invasion by a neighbouring kingdom seeking territorial gain. It was the arrival of a military order that had transformed warfare into something approaching demonic ritual, pushing the boundaries of human cruelty so far beyond normal combat that their very presence on a battlefield changed the fundamental nature of survival itself. The Crimson Brotherhood had originated decades earlier in the war-torn principalities beyond the Ashen Wastes, where constant warfare and religious fanaticism had created a warrior cult that viewed extreme violence not as a necessary evil, but as a sacred duty. Their military doctrine was built around the principle that causing maximum suffering to enemies would break the will to resist more effectively than simple killing, leading them to develop combat techniques that prioritized prolonged agony over efficient termination. Intelligence reports reaching Valdrian commanders described battlefield practices that challenged the imagination of even survival-focused knights who thought they had seen every possible horror of warfare. The Crimson Brotherhood employed specialized weapons designed not to kill quickly, but to inflict wounds that would cause victims to die slowly while remaining conscious and capable of screaming. Their arrows were barbed and sometimes poisoned with substances that caused paralysis without unconsciousness, leaving victims unable to move but fully aware as they were subjected to further torments. More disturbing still were their psychological warfare techniques. The Brotherhood had developed systematic methods for breaking enemy morale through carefully orchestrated displays of extreme cruelty. They would capture enemy soldiers alive not for ransom or information, but specifically to torture them within sight and hearing of opposing forces. These exhibitions of suffering were designed to create such fear among enemy troops that many would flee or surrender rather than risk capture themselves. The arrival of such an enemy forced Valdrian knights to confront survival challenges that went far beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Traditional survival techniques like death mimicry became not just ineffective, but actively dangerous when facing enemies who specialized in detecting and prolonging life in their victims. The Crimson Brotherhood had developed countermeasures specifically designed to identify knights attempting to feign death, including techniques for detecting minimal breathing, testing pain responses, and even inflicting wounds that would cause involuntary reactions in living tissue. Sir Gareth the Ironclad, now recognized as Valdris's foremost authority on survival warfare, was tasked with developing new defensive strategies against an enemy that seemed to have anticipated and prepared for every conventional survival technique. The challenge was unprecedented. How do you hide from enemies who specialize in finding hidden life? How do you escape from warriors who have made the pursuit and capture of fleeing opponents into an art form? The answer required survival techniques so extreme that they challenged the very definition of humanity. Sir Gareth began developing what he privately called transcendence protocols, methods that pushed human endurance and psychological resilience beyond normal limits to achieve states that barely qualified as conscious existence. These techniques involved training nights to enter trance-like states where bodily functions slowed to near-death levels while maintaining just enough awareness to respond to changing circumstances. The training process for transcendence protocols was itself a form of controlled torture that many knights could not survive. Candidates were subjected to gradually increasing levels of physical and psychological stress designed to expand their tolerance for pain and their ability to maintain rational thought under extreme duress. They learned to slow their heartbeat and breathing to levels that would fool even experienced medical examination, while simultaneously developing the mental discipline to remain aware of their surroundings and capable of instant response if discovered. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological conditioning required to interact with Crimson Brotherhood forces without betraying fear or revulsion. Knights had to learn to witness acts of extreme cruelty without displaying emotional responses that might mark them as enemies. This required a level of emotional detachment that fundamentally altered their humanity, creating warriors who could watch torture and murder with the same calm attention they might give to observing weather patterns. The first major engagement between Valdrian forces and the Crimson Brotherhood occurred at the Battle of Bloodmere, where traditional Valdrian survival tactics met their ultimate test against an enemy that had specifically prepared to counter them. The result was a nightmare that redefined the boundaries of human experience and pushed survival techniques into realms that bordered on the supernatural. Sir Marcus Blackwood, the youngest member of Sir Gareth's original Brotherhood and now a seasoned survival expert himself, found himself trapped behind enemy lines when Valdrian forces were forced to retreat from their initial positions. What followed was a test of transcendence protocols under the most extreme possible conditions, evading capture by enemies who specialized in hunting hidden survivors while wounded and operating in unfamiliar territory. The psychological pressure of knowing that capture meant not just death, but prolonged torture created a level of stress that pushed Marcus beyond the normal limits of human endurance. For 3 days, he remained hidden in a partially collapsed cellar beneath a burned farmhouse, listening to the sounds of Crimson Brotherhood forces systematically searching the area for survivors. The searchers employed techniques that went beyond normal military procedure. They used trained dogs to detect human scent, applied fire to potential hiding places to force out concealed enemies, and even brought captured Valdrian soldiers to torture within hearing distance of suspected hiding spots, hoping to provoke hidden comrades into revealing themselves through emotional responses. Marcus's survival required him to maintain transcendence protocols for 72 consecutive hours, while listening to the screams of men he knew personally being slowly tortured to death. The psychological techniques necessary to endure this experience without either revealing his location or suffering complete mental breakdown pushed the boundaries of what the human mind could withstand while remaining functional. The methods he employed went beyond traditional meditation or mental discipline into realms that resembled supernatural transformation. Marcus learned to partially disconnect his consciousness from his physical body, experiencing the torture sounds and his own hunger, thirst, and pain as distant sensations that belonged to someone else. This dissociative state allowed him to maintain the emotional detachment necessary for survival, while preserving enough rational awareness to respond to immediate threats. But the cost of such techniques was devastating. When Marcus finally emerged from hiding after Crimson Brotherhood forces moved on, he had undergone psychological changes that were immediately apparent to those who knew him. The warm, gregarious young knight who had entered the battle had been replaced by someone who seemed to exist at an emotional distance from normal human experience. He spoke in monotone, showed no reaction to humour or tragedy, and displayed an unsettling calm even in dangerous situations. The transcendence protocols that had saved Marcus's life had also fundamentally altered his humanity in ways that might never be reversible. He had survived by learning to partially abandon his essential self, and the person who emerged from that cellar was not quite the same human being who had entered it. The implications of such survival techniques extended far beyond individual psychological damage. Valdrian military leadership realized they were creating warriors who barely qualified as human in any traditional sense, beings who could survive impossible circumstances but only by abandoning the emotional and moral qualities that defined normal human existence. The question that haunted commanders was whether victory achieved through such methods could be considered worth the cost, and whether warriors transformed by transcendence protocols could ever successfully reintegrate into the society they had sacrificed their humanity to protect. The aftermath of Bloodmere created an unexpected phenomenon that would fundamentally alter Valdrian society's relationship with survival warfare. Rather than recoiling in horror from the extreme techniques their knights had been forced to develop, the civilian population became obsessed with the spectacle of transcendent survival, transforming the grim necessities of battlefield endurance into a form of public entertainment that rivaled the grandest tournaments of more civilized kingdoms. The transformation began innocuously enough. In taverns and market squares throughout Valdris, stories of Sir Marcus Blackwood's 3-day ordeal spread with the embellishment and exaggeration typical of folk tales. But rather than focusing on the horror of his experience, these stories emphasized the almost supernatural aspects of his survival techniques, his ability to slow his breathing to near-death levels, his transcendence of normal human emotional responses, his transformation into something that seemed more spirit than flesh. Lord Commander Aldwyn Grimthorne, recognizing an opportunity to boost military recruitment and public morale, authorized the creation of what were initially called endurance demonstrations, controlled exhibitions where volunteer knights would display survival techniques for civilian audiences. These events were presented as educational programs designed to help the population understand and appreciate the sacrifices their protectors made, but they quickly evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. The first formal demonstration was held in the main courtyard of Ravenshollow Keep during the Spring Festival of 1254. Sir Gareth the Ironclad himself participated, demonstrating death mimicry techniques before an audience of local nobles and wealthy merchants. The performance began with what appeared to be a standard combat exhibition, but when Sir Gareth was struck down by his sparring partner, something extraordinary happened. Instead of rising to acknowledge the crowd as would be expected in normal tournament combat, Sir Gareth remained motionless on the ground for nearly an hour. Medical attendants examined him publicly, checking for pulse and breathing while providing commentary to the audience about the techniques being employed. The crowd watched in fascinated silence as Gareth's body appeared completely lifeless, his skin taking on the pallor of genuine death, his breathing so shallow as to be undetectable. When he finally revived, the audience's reaction was unlike anything seen in traditional tournament settings. Rather than the cheering and applause typical of martial exhibitions, the crowd responded with an awed silence that bordered on religious reverence. Many spectators reported feeling they had witnessed something approaching divine miracle, a human being's conquest of death itself. Word of these demonstrations spread rapidly throughout the kingdom and beyond, attracting visitors from distant realms who came specifically to witness what became known as death performances. The economic implications were immediate and substantial. Taverns near demonstration sites reported unprecedented bookings, merchants found eager markets for souvenirs and commemorative items, and local lords discovered they could charge substantial fees for access to the most dramatic exhibitions. The popularity of death performances led to competitive pressures that pushed participants toward increasingly extreme displays. Knights began developing new variations of transcendence protocols specifically for public exhibition, creating techniques that were more visually dramatic than militarily practical. Some participants learned to remain dead for multiple hours, while buried under soil or submerged in water. Others developed the ability to endure apparent torture while maintaining death-like states that convinced audiences they were witnessing genuine martyrdom. The psychological effects on both performers and audiences were profound and largely unforeseen. Knights who had originally developed transcendence protocols as desperate survival measures found themselves addicted to the altered states of consciousness these techniques produced. The dissociative experiences that had once been emergency responses to life-threatening situations became sought-after escapes from the trauma and stress of normal existence. Sir Marcus Blackwood became the most celebrated performer in these exhibitions, his natural talent for transcendent states making him capable of displays that bordered on the supernatural. Audiences would travel for weeks to witness his corpse sleep performances, where he would remain buried alive for days at a time while maintaining just enough awareness to respond to predetermined signals that proved his continued existence. But Marcus's success came at a terrible personal cost. The repeated use of transcendence protocols for entertainment purposes gradually eroded his ability to maintain normal consciousness states. He began experiencing involuntary dissociative episodes during routine activities, sometimes disappearing mentally for hours while his body continued functioning automatically. Friends and family reported that he seemed to be slowly fading away, becoming less present and responsive even when not actively performing. The cultural impact of death performances extended far beyond entertainment into the realm of religious and philosophical transformation. Traditional Valdrian spirituality had emphasized the importance of living well and dying with honor, but the spectacle of knights transcending death created new theological questions about the nature of human existence and the relationship between body and soul. Some religious authorities condemned the performances as blasphemous attempts to mock divine power over life and death. Others embraced them as evidence of human potential for spiritual transcendence, incorporating elements of survival techniques into religious practices and meditation disciplines. The resulting theological debates fractured established religious institutions and gave rise to new spiritual movements that viewed transcendent warriors as prophets of human evolution. The social stratification effects were equally dramatic. Families whose sons demonstrated aptitude for transcendence protocols found themselves elevated to new levels of prestige and wealth. Communities competed to produce the most talented death performers, leading to systematic programs for identifying and training children who showed potential for dissociative abilities. This created a form of social mobility based not on traditional virtues like courage or piety, but on the capacity for controlled psychological self-destruction. The transformation of survival techniques into public spectacle also attracted international attention that proved politically significant. Diplomatic visitors from neighbouring kingdoms often requested private demonstrations of Valdrian death performances, viewing them as evidence of the kingdom's military capabilities. Some foreign observers reported back to their rulers that Valdris possessed warriors who were effectively immune to normal combat techniques, leading to diplomatic concessions and trade agreements based partially on fear of supernatural military abilities. However, the most disturbing aspect of the death performance culture was its effect on military effectiveness. Knights who had originally developed transcendence protocols for genuine survival needs found themselves more interested in perfecting techniques for audience appeal than for battlefield application. The competitive pressure to create more spectacular exhibitions led to innovations that actually reduced combat effectiveness while increasing entertainment value. The line between survival technique and performance art became increasingly blurred, creating a generation of warriors who were simultaneously more psychologically extreme and less practically effective than their predecessors. They could achieve states of consciousness that seemed supernatural to observers, but struggled with basic military tasks that required normal human emotional responses and social cooperation. By 1255, the death performance culture had become so central to Valdrian identity that military training programs were modified to accommodate its requirements, creating the bizarre situation of a kingdom whose military doctrine was being shaped by entertainment considerations rather than tactical effectiveness. The question facing military leadership was whether they had discovered a new form of cultural power that could supplement traditional warfare, or whether they had allowed the spectacle of survival to replace its substance, creating a military force that looked supernatural but had lost its practical edge when facing enemies who couldn't be defeated through psychological intimidation alone. The siege of Ironhold Fortress in the winter of 1255 would become the ultimate test of everything Valdrian knights had learned about survival, pushing their techniques beyond the realm of military necessity into territories that challenged the very definition of human endurance. What began as a conventional military engagement evolved into a nightmare that revealed the absolute limits of transcendence protocols and forced both besiegers and defenders to confront horrors that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. Ironhold Fortress stood at the confluence of 3 mountain passes, its massive walls carved directly from living rock and reinforced with steel core masonry, that had withstood sieges for over 2 centuries. The Crimson Brotherhood's decision to assault this seemingly impregnable stronghold wasn't motivated by strategic necessity, but by their desire to break the growing legend of Valdrian invincibility. They had observed the death performances that had spread throughout the kingdom and recognized that defeating Valdris required not just military victory, but the systematic destruction of the psychological foundations that enabled transcendent survival. The Brotherhood's siege tactics were designed specifically to counter Transcendence protocols through methods that pushed defenders beyond the limits of human endurance. Rather than attempting to breach the walls through conventional assault, they employed what their commanders called consciousness warfare, systematic techniques designed to prevent defenders from accessing the dissociative states that had made Valdrian knights nearly impossible to defeat in previous engagements. The siege began with psychological warfare that went far beyond traditional intimidation tactics. The Crimson Brotherhood had brought with them a collection of captured Valdrian civilians, men, women and children taken during their advance through the countryside. These prisoners were tortured within sight and hearing of the fortress walls, their agonies carefully orchestrated to create specific psychological pressures that would interfere with defenders' ability to maintain transcendent states. But the Brotherhood's most diabolical innovation was their use of what they called empathy weapons, torture techniques specifically designed to trigger involuntary emotional responses in observers. They had studied the Transcendence protocols employed by Valdrian knights and identified the precise types of suffering that were most likely to break through dissociative barriers. Children were tortured in ways that mimicked the childhood experiences of specific defenders. Captured knights were forced to watch as their family members were subjected to agonies that precisely replicated the trauma-induced dissociation that formed the foundation of Transcendence training. Sir Gareth the Ironclad, now serving as commander of Ironhold's defence, faced the impossible task of maintaining his garrison's psychological stability while surrounded by carefully orchestrated horrors designed to destroy their survival capabilities. The traditional response would have been to employ Transcendence protocols to maintain emotional detachment from the suffering outside the walls, but the Brotherhood's techniques made such detachment increasingly difficult to achieve and maintain. The first major crisis came when the Brotherhood captured Sir Marcus Blackwood during a reconnaissance mission beyond the fortress walls. Marcus had become so identified with transcendent survival that his capture represented both a practical and symbolic disaster for Valdrian morale. But rather than simply executing him, the Brotherhood employed him as a weapon against his own comrades through methods that revealed the darkest possibilities of survival warfare. Using their detailed knowledge of Transcendence protocols, the Brotherhood began systematically breaking down Marcus's psychological defenses through techniques that specifically targeted the dissociative mechanisms he had developed. They subjected him to experiences designed to trigger involuntary emotional responses, while preventing him from accessing the mental states that had previously allowed him to endure extreme suffering. The goal wasn't simply to cause pain, but to demonstrate to the fortress defenders that their most celebrated survival techniques could be systematically countered and turned against them. The psychological warfare reached its climax when the Brotherhood forced Marcus to participate in a grotesque parody of the death performances that had made him famous throughout Valdris. They constructed a stage within sight of the fortress walls where Marcus was compelled to demonstrate Transcendence protocols while being subjected to torture that gradually escalated beyond his ability to maintain dissociative states. The defenders were forced to watch as their greatest symbol of survival as Transcendence was systematically broken down, his legendary abilities revealed as ultimately inadequate against enemies who understood and could counter them. The impact on fortress morale was devastating. Knights who had spent years developing confidence in their Transcendence abilities found themselves facing the terrifying possibility that their survival techniques were not just inadequate, but potentially counterproductive against enemies who had studied and prepared for them. The psychological security that had enabled Valdrian military success began crumbling as defenders realized they might be more vulnerable than ordinary soldiers who hadn't developed dependencies on transcendent states. Sir Gareth faced the unprecedented challenge of maintaining defensive effectiveness while his garrison underwent collective psychological breakdown. Traditional military discipline proved inadequate for managing knights whose survival techniques were being systematically dismantled by enemy action. Some defenders became catatonic as their Transcendence protocols collapsed under psychological pressure. Others became hyper-aggressive, abandoning survival techniques entirely in favor of suicidal attacks that accomplished nothing beyond providing the Brotherhood with additional prisoners to use as psychological weapons. The fortress's physical defences remained intact, but the psychological foundations of Valdrian military power were disintegrating under pressures that no amount of training had prepared them to handle. The Brotherhood had discovered that survival techniques developed under one set of circumstances could become liabilities when facing enemies who had specifically prepared to exploit their psychological mechanisms. Most disturbing was the revelation that transcendence protocols, which had seemed to represent the evolution of human consciousness beyond normal limitations, were actually forms of psychological dependency that made practitioners more vulnerable to certain types of manipulation than untrained individuals. Knights who had sacrificed their normal emotional responses to develop survival abilities found themselves defenseless against enemies who could trigger the very traumas that had originally motivated their transcendence training. The Siege of Ironhold became a laboratory for exploring the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. Both sides pushed survival techniques beyond their intended applications, creating new forms of warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the boundaries of human experience. The Brotherhood's systematic assault on transcendence protocols revealed that the survival techniques Valdrians had considered their greatest military advantage were actually sophisticated forms of psychological conditioning that could be exploited by sufficiently knowledgeable enemies. As winter deepened and the siege continued, the distinction between survival technique and systematic torture became increasingly meaningless. Defenders and attackers alike were transformed by experiences that pushed them beyond the normal boundaries of human consciousness into realms where traditional concepts of victory and defeat became irrelevant compared to the simple question of whether it was possible to maintain any recognizable form of humanity while enduring such extremes. The Siege of Ironhold would ultimately reveal whether the transcendent survival techniques that had defined Valdrian military culture represented genuine human evolution or merely elaborate forms of psychological self-destruction that had been mistaken for strength. The answer would reshape not just military doctrine, but fundamental understanding of what it meant to survive when survival itself had become a form of slow spiritual death. The Siege of Ironhold ended not with victory or defeat, but with a revelation that would fundamentally alter the course of medieval warfare throughout the known world. In the spring of 1256, as the last snows melted from the Thornwood Mountains, both the Crimson Brotherhood and the defenders of Ironhold made a discovery that rendered their entire conflict meaningless. The transcendence techniques that had defined Valdrian survival warfare were beginning to appear spontaneously among knights throughout Europe, spreading like a contagion that recognized no borders, allegiances, or national identities. The first reports came from the Kingdom of Astoria, where knights facing routine border skirmishes began exhibiting behaviours that precisely matched Valdrian transcendence protocols despite having no contact with Valdrian military training. Astorian commanders reported instances of their knights entering death-like states during combat, displaying supernatural endurance under torture and demonstrating psychological detachment that bordered on the inhuman. These manifestations occurred without any formal training or cultural conditioning, suggesting that transcendence techniques represented not an innovation in military doctrine, but the emergence of a fundamental change in human consciousness itself. Similar phenomena were documented across the continent. In the Germanic principalities, knights began spontaneously developing dissociative abilities during particularly brutal campaigns. French nobles reported that their warriors were exhibiting emotional numbness and supernatural pain tolerance that resembled the legendary abilities of Valdrian death performers. Even in distant England, military observers noted the appearance of survival techniques that seemed to emerge from necessity rather than instruction. The implications were staggering. The survival methods that Valdrians had assumed were unique products of their specific training and cultural circumstances appeared to be natural human adaptations to extreme warfare conditions. The transcendence protocols weren't innovations. They were evolutionary responses that emerged whenever human beings were pushed beyond normal psychological limits by the demands of survival. This realization forced a complete re-evaluation of what had occurred in Valdris over the previous decades. The kingdom hadn't developed superior military techniques through cultural innovation. It had simply been the first region where warfare conditions had become extreme enough to trigger latent human survival mechanisms. The death performances, the systematic psychological conditioning, the elaborate theoretical framework surrounding transcendence. All of these had been cultural elaborations built around natural processes that were beginning to manifest throughout the medieval world as warfare itself became increasingly brutal and psychologically demanding. Military scholars began documenting what they termed parallel evolution in survival techniques across multiple kingdoms. Knights who had never heard of Valdrian methods were independently developing death mimicry, tactical dissociation, and emotional detachment protocols that closely matched those pioneered by Sir Gareth and his contemporaries. The consistency of these developments across different cultures and military traditions suggested that transcendence techniques represented a form of human adaptation rather than cultural innovation. The political ramifications were immediate and destabilizing. Kingdoms that had viewed Valdris as a unique military threat suddenly realized they were dealing with phenomena that could emerge within their own forces. The transcendent survival abilities that had seemed to give Valdris decisive military advantages were beginning to appear among knights who might just as easily be turned against their original enemies as deployed in support of them. More disturbing was the recognition that the psychological costs associated with transcendence techniques were also appearing universally. Knights throughout Europe began exhibiting the same patterns of emotional numbness, dissociative episodes, and gradual dehumanization that had characterized advanced Valdrian survival practitioners. The price of developing supernatural survival abilities appeared to be built into the techniques themselves, regardless of how they were acquired or applied. The Crimson Brotherhood, having observed these developments during their siege of Ironhold, made a strategic decision that shocked their enemies and allies alike. They abandoned their campaign against Valdris and began systematically recruiting transcendent knights from all kingdoms, regardless of their original allegiances. Their religious fanaticism had evolved into something approaching scientific fascination with the possibilities of human consciousness transformation, leading them to view transcendent warriors not as enemies to be defeated, but as specimens to be studied and potential converts to their cause. This recruitment strategy proved devastatingly effective. Knights who had been psychologically broken by transcendence training often found themselves more comfortable among the Brotherhood's ranks than within their original military cultures. The emotional detachment and moral flexibility that made them effective survivors also made them adaptable to new allegiances and ideologies. Many transcendent knights discovered that their psychological conditioning had left them feeling more kinship with fellow practitioners of extreme survival techniques than with their birth cultures or original military companions. The Brotherhood's transformation from a religious military order into an international organization dedicated to consciousness research represented a new phase in medieval warfare. They established training centers throughout Europe where transcendent knights could develop their abilities without the cultural constraints that had limited their development in traditional military structures. These centers became magnets for warriors who had been psychologically damaged by conventional military service and were seeking communities that could understand and accommodate their altered consciousness states. The emergence of transcendence techniques as a continental phenomenon also led to technological and medical developments that had previously been impossible. Physicians began studying the physiological aspects of dissociative states, leading to advances in understanding pain management, psychological trauma treatment, and the relationship between consciousness and physical endurance. Military engineers developed new weapons and defensive systems designed specifically to counter or enhance transcendent abilities. Perhaps most significantly, the spread of transcendence techniques began altering the fundamental nature of medieval society. The traditional social contracts that governed relationships between lords and vassals, knights and peasants, had been built around assumptions about human psychological capabilities that were being systematically challenged by the emergence of warriors who operated beyond normal emotional and moral constraints. Communities throughout Europe found themselves dealing with returning veterans whose psychological conditioning made them poorly suited for civilian life. The economic and social costs of supporting transcendent knights during peacetime created new forms of political instability, as traditional support systems proved inadequate for managing warriors who had been fundamentally altered by their survival training. The question facing European civilization was whether the emergence of transcendent survival abilities represented an evolutionary advancement that would enhance human survival capabilities, or a form of psychological adaptation that would ultimately prove destructive to the social and cultural foundations that made civilization possible. The transformation had already begun. and its ultimate consequences would reshape not just military affairs, but the fundamental nature of human society in ways that medieval minds could barely comprehend. The gentle spring rain that fell upon the ruins of Ironhold Fortress in the year 1257 seemed to wash away more than just the bloodstains that had marked its stones for so many months. As Sir Gareth the Ironclad stood among the abandoned battlements, watching the last of the Crimson Brotherhood's ships disappear beyond the horizon, he carried within himself the profound weight of understanding what his kingdom, and indeed all of medieval Europe, had truly become through their desperate pursuit of survival. The transformation had been complete, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The transcendent survival techniques that had begun as desperate battlefield innovations had evolved into something that transcended warfare itself, becoming a fundamental shift in human consciousness that would define the next phase of European civilization. What had started as methods for staying alive in impossible circumstances had become a new form of human existence, one that offered extraordinary capabilities at the cost of everything that had previously defined humanity. Yet in the quiet moments after the storm of conflict had passed, a different kind of wisdom began to emerge. Sir Gareth's own journey from common-born survivor to legendary commander had taught him that the most profound survival skill wasn't the ability to transcend humanity, but the capacity to preserve it even under the most extreme circumstances. The knights who had maintained their essential humanity while developing transcendent abilities, those who had found ways to employ extreme survival techniques without losing their capacity for love, compassion, and moral reasoning, had ultimately proven more valuable than those who had achieved perfect tactical transcendence at the cost of their souls. This realization had profound implications for how survival techniques would be understood and applied in the future. The early assumption that maximum effectiveness required complete emotional detachment had proven false. Knights who maintained connections to their fundamental humanity, even while developing supernatural survival abilities, demonstrated greater long-term resilience and more stable psychological profiles than those who had achieved perfect transcendence through complete dissociation. The young page Cassius Thornfield, now a knight himself, had become living proof of this principle. Under Sir Gareth's guidance, he had learned to employ transcendence techniques selectively, using them as tools rather than as permanent alterations to his consciousness. He could access death-like states when survival demanded it, but he retained the ability to return fully to normal human emotional experience when circumstances permitted. This balanced approach had proven both militarily effective and psychologically sustainable, pointing toward a future where transcendent abilities could be integrated into human experience rather than replacing it entirely. The broader implications of this discovery extended far beyond military applications. Throughout Europe, communities were learning to support transcendent veterans not by trying to normalize them according to pre-war standards, but by creating new social structures that could accommodate their altered capabilities while helping them maintain connections to their essential humanity. Veterans' guilds emerged that functioned as bridge communities between transcendent warriors and civilian society, providing spaces where former knights could gradually readjust to normal human emotional experience while retaining access to their survival abilities when needed. Religious institutions too began developing new theological frameworks that could incorporate transcendent experiences into spiritual practice without abandoning traditional moral teachings. Some monasteries became centers for studying the relationship between consciousness, alteration, and spiritual development, exploring whether transcendence techniques might offer new pathways to mystical experience that could enhance rather than replace conventional religious practice. The economic transformations proved equally significant. The high costs associated with training and maintaining transcendent knights led to innovations in military financing that resembled early forms of insurance and investment banking. Lords learned to spread the risks of military investment across multiple knights and campaigns, while knights themselves began forming mutual support associations that could provide economic security for members who were temporarily or permanently disabled by psychological trauma. Perhaps most importantly, the spread of transcendence techniques had begun creating new forms of international cooperation. Knights who had undergone similar consciousness alterations often felt stronger bonds with foreign practitioners than with their own countrymen, leading to informal networks that transcended national boundaries. These connections sometimes prevented conflicts by providing communication channels between potential enemies and sometimes facilitated more effective military cooperation when wars did occur. The Crimson Brotherhood's transformation from military threat to research organization represented the most dramatic example of how transcendence phenomena were reshaping international relations. Their centers for consciousness research had become neutral territories where knights from opposing kingdoms could study together, share techniques, and develop mutual understanding that often prevented the escalation of political conflicts into military ones. But the true measure of what had been accomplished lay not in these grand transformations, but in the individual human stories of survival and adaptation. Sir Marcus Blackwood, despite his traumatic experiences during the siege, had gradually recovered much of his emotional capacity through careful rehabilitation that combined transcendence techniques with conventional healing methods. His journey back toward full humanity had become a model for helping other psychologically damaged warriors reclaim their lives without losing the survival abilities that had kept them alive. The kingdom of Valdris itself had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a society that had successfully integrated extreme survival capabilities into civilian life without losing its essential cultural identity. The death performances that had once seemed like elaborate entertainment had become genuine spiritual practices that helped both participants and observers explore the boundaries of human consciousness in controlled, supportive environments. As Sir Gareth reflected on the journey that had brought him from a terrified child hiding in coal piles to one of Europe's most respected military innovators, he recognized that the most important lesson had been learning when not to employ survival techniques. True mastery wasn't about achieving perfect transcendence, but about developing the wisdom to know when transcendence was necessary and when it was more important to remain fully human. The Knights of Valdris had indeed learned to survive brutal battles, but their greatest achievement had been learning to survive their own survival techniques, to develop capabilities that went beyond normal human limits while retaining the essential qualities that made survival worthwhile. They had discovered that the ultimate victory wasn't just staying alive, but remaining human enough to enjoy the life they had fought so hard to preserve. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, dear listener, perhaps you can find comfort in knowing that even in humanity's darkest hours, when survival required the development of abilities that challenged the very definition of human nature, some individuals found ways to preserve the light of compassion, wisdom, and love that makes existence meaningful. The Knights of Valdris learned that true strength lies not in transcending our humanity, but in expanding it to encompass even the most extreme challenges, while never forgetting what we're fighting to protect. Rest well, knowing that survival and humanity need not be enemies, and that even the most brutal realities cannot extinguish the human capacity for growth, adaptation, and hope. Good night, fellow travellers, through the complexities of human experience. The autumn of 1260 brought an unexpected visitor to the gates of Ravenshollow Keep, a young woman whose arrival would challenge everything the Knights of Valdris thought they understood about the nature of transcendence and survival. Lady Alara Nightwhisper claimed to be a scholar from the distant northern realms, but her presence carried with it an aura of knowledge that seemed to penetrate the carefully constructed psychological defences that even the most advanced transcendent knights maintained as second nature. Unlike the male-dominated warrior culture that had defined Valdrian survival techniques, Lady Alara brought with her accounts of an entirely different approach to consciousness transcendence, one that had emerged among the women of the northern realms who had been forced to develop their own survival methods during the devastating plague years that had decimated their populations. Where Valdrian knights had achieved transcendence through controlled psychological dissociation and emotional detachment, northern women had developed what Alara called integrative transcendence, techniques that enhanced rather than suppressed emotional and empathetic capabilities. The fundamental difference in approach was immediately apparent to Sir Gareth and his colleagues. While Valdrian transcendence protocols were built around the ability to temporarily abandon one's humanity in order to survive impossible circumstances, the northern techniques were designed to expand human consciousness to encompass greater levels of awareness and connection while maintaining full emotional engagement with reality. Where Valdrian knights learned to become temporarily less than human in order to survive, northern practitioners learned to become temporarily more than human while retaining their essential humanity. Lady Alara's demonstrations of these alternative techniques proved both fascinating and disturbing to knights who had spent years developing completely opposite approaches to consciousness alteration. She could achieve states of heightened awareness that surpassed even the most advanced Valdrian transcendence. But rather than appearing emotionally detached or psychologically damaged, she seemed more alive, more present, and more connected to her surroundings than normal human consciousness typically allowed. Most remarkably, her techniques appeared to heal rather than damage the psychological wounds that conventional transcendence protocols inevitably created. Knights who had suffered from the emotional numbness and dissociative episodes characteristic of advanced transcendent practitioners found that exposure to integrative techniques began reversing some of their psychological damage, allowing them to recover emotional capacities they had thought permanently lost. The theological implications were staggering. Where Valdrian transcendence had required practitioners to essentially sacrifice their souls for survival, integrative transcendence suggested the possibility of achieving supernatural abilities while actually enhancing rather than diminishing one's spiritual and emotional life. Religious authorities who had struggled for years to reconcile survival techniques with Christian moral teaching suddenly found themselves confronting evidence that transcendence might actually represent a form of spiritual development rather than spiritual degradation. But the integration of northern techniques into Valdrian military culture proved far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Knights who had spent years conditioning themselves to suppress emotional responses found it nearly impossible to employ methods that required enhanced emotional engagement. The psychological habits that had kept them alive in extreme combat situations became barriers that prevented them from accessing alternative forms of transcendence that might have been more psychologically sustainable. More disturbing was the discovery that some knights had become so psychologically dependent on dissociative transcendence that they were no longer capable of experiencing normal human emotional states without assistance. For these individuals, the prospect of integrative transcendence represented not an opportunity for healing, but a terrifying loss of the psychological defenses that had become essential to their basic functioning. Lady Alara's research also revealed that the consciousness changes occurring throughout Europe were more complex and varied than anyone had previously understood. Rather than representing a single evolutionary development, transcendence phenomena appeared to be manifesting in multiple forms depending on cultural context, individual psychology, and environmental pressures. The Valdrian approach was just one possible adaptation among many, each with its own advantages, limitations, and psychological costs. The most profound revelation came when Lady Alara demonstrated that transcendent abilities weren't limited to warriors or extreme survival situations. Under the right conditions, ordinary civilians could develop consciousness capabilities that rivaled those of the most advanced knights, suggesting that the human potential for transcendence was far more widespread than military applications had indicated. This discovery had revolutionary implications for medieval society, raising questions about the fundamental nature of human consciousness and the possibilities for individual and collective development. Perhaps most importantly, Lady Alara's work suggested that the psychological damage associated with Valdrian transcendence techniques wasn't an inevitable cost of developing supernatural abilities, but rather a consequence of specific training methods that prioritized immediate effectiveness over long-term psychological health. Alternative approaches could potentially achieve similar or superior results without the devastating personal costs that had characterized Valdrian survival culture. As winter approached and Lady Alara prepared to continue her research in other kingdoms, Sir Gareth found himself confronting the possibility that everything he had achieved, every technique he had developed, every knight he had trained, every innovation that had defined his career, might represent only the first primitive steps toward understanding human consciousness potential. The survival methods that had seemed like the ultimate expression of human adaptability might actually be crude approximations of capabilities that could be developed more safely and effectively through entirely different approaches. The Knights of Valdris faced a choice that would determine not just their military future, but the fundamental nature of their society. They could continue developing the dissociative transcendence techniques that had brought them military success at enormous psychological cost, or they could begin the difficult process of learning alternative methods that offered the possibility of supernatural abilities without the sacrifice of their essential humanity. As you settle into peaceful rest, dear listener, consider the profound wisdom hidden within this choice. Sometimes our greatest strength lies not in perfecting the methods that have brought us success, but in having the courage to abandon those methods when we discover better possibilities. The Knights of Valdris had learned to survive impossible battles, but their ultimate test would be learning to survive their own success, to recognize when the techniques that had saved them had also limited them, and to find the wisdom to evolve beyond their own achievements. Sleep peacefully, knowing that human potential for growth and adaptation extends far beyond what any single approach can reveal, and that the most important survival skill of all might be the willingness to continue learning, changing, and becoming more than we ever thought possible. The summer of 1263 brought news that would force the Knights of Valdris to confront the ultimate consequences of their Transcendence revolution. Children throughout the kingdom were being born with natural abilities that surpassed even the most advanced techniques developed by veteran warriors. These infants demonstrated consciousness capabilities that seemed to emerge spontaneously, without training or conditioning, suggesting that the widespread use of transcendence protocols had triggered genetic or spiritual changes that were being passed to the next generation. The first documented case occurred in the village of Millbrook, where a newborn named Thomas Starweaver displayed remarkable responses to his environment that defied normal infant development patterns. Within days of birth, he demonstrated the ability to enter death-like states when experiencing distress, his breathing and heartbeat slowing to levels that would have indicated serious medical crisis in ordinary children. Yet he would emerge from these states completely healthy and apparently refreshed, as though he had discovered an innate survival mechanism that required no conscious effort to employ. More disturbing were reports of infants who seemed to respond empathically to the emotional states of adults around them, displaying awareness of psychological conditions that normal babies couldn't possibly perceive. Some children appeared to instinctively recognize transcendent knights by exhibiting calmer behavior in their presence, while others showed signs of distress when exposed to knights whose psychological conditioning included particularly severe dissociative elements. The medical implications challenged everything physicians thought they understood about human development. These children required entirely different approaches to healthcare, as their natural transcendent abilities made conventional medical diagnosis nearly impossible. Traditional methods for assessing infant health became meaningless when dealing with babies who could spontaneously alter their vital signs in ways that mimicked serious illness or death. Perhaps most remarkably, some children seem to be born with integrated transcendence capabilities that combine the survival benefits of Valdrian techniques with the emotional enhancement described by Lady Alara. These infants demonstrated supernatural resilience and awareness, while maintaining normal emotional responsiveness and social development. They appeared to represent a natural synthesis of different transcendence approaches that previous generations had needed to develop through years of difficult training. The social implications were equally profound. Families found themselves raising children whose capabilities they couldn't understand or properly support. Traditional parenting methods proved inadequate for managing infants, whose transcendent abilities made normal discipline and guidance ineffective. Some children could enter trance states to avoid unwanted experiences, while others demonstrated empathic abilities that allowed them to manipulate adult emotions in ways that made conventional child-rearing impossible. Educational institutions throughout Valdris faced the challenge of developing new pedagogical approaches for children whose consciousness operated according to principles that hadn't existed when current teaching methods were developed. Traditional literacy and numeracy instruction proved inadequate for minds that could process information through transcendent awareness channels that bypassed normal cognitive development patterns. The military implications were perhaps the most disturbing of all. Children born with natural transcendence abilities represented potential warriors whose capabilities would far exceed those of current knights, but their integration into military culture raised ethical questions that previous generations had never needed to consider. The idea of training naturally transcendent children for warfare seemed to cross moral boundaries that even the survival-focused culture of Valdris found difficult to contemplate. More concerning was the possibility that these children might not be compatible with traditional military structures at all. Their natural abilities seemed to operate according to principles that valued integration and emotional awareness over the controlled dissociation that characterized conventional Valdrian training. Attempting to impose traditional military discipline on naturally transcendent children might damage their innate abilities while failing to develop practical combat skills. Religious authorities faced equally complex challenges in understanding the spiritual significance of children born with transcendent capabilities. Some viewed these births as evidence of divine blessing, proof that humanity was evolving toward higher spiritual states under divine guidance. Others feared that transcendent children represented a departure from God's original design for human nature, potentially indicating spiritual corruption rather than advancement. The theological debates became particularly intense when examining children who demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal physical limitations. Some infants appeared capable of perceiving events occurring at distances that made normal sensory awareness impossible, while others showed signs of understanding concepts and languages they had never been exposed to. These phenomena challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, physical reality, and spiritual experience. Sir Gareth, now recognized as one of the kingdom's foremost authorities on transcendence development, found himself appointed to lead a special council tasked with developing policies for managing the transcendent child phenomenon. The responsibility was overwhelming, as it required making decisions about human development that would affect not just individual families, but the entire future of Valdrian civilization. The Council's research revealed that transcendent children appeared to be developing at different rates and in different directions depending on their family environments and early experiences. Children raised by families with transcendent parents seemed to develop more stable and integrated abilities, while those born to conventional families often struggled with control and integration issues that could prove dangerous to themselves and others. Most significantly, the Council discovered that transcendent children seemed to possess an innate understanding of consciousness principles that had taken adult practitioners years to develop through difficult training. These children intuitively employed techniques that combined the best aspects of different transcendence approaches while avoiding many of the psychological pitfalls that had characterized earlier development methods. The implications extended far beyond Valdris itself. Reports from other kingdoms indicated that similar phenomena were occurring throughout Europe, wherever transcendence techniques had become widespread. Humanity appeared to be undergoing a fundamental evolutionary transition that would reshape civilization in ways that current political and social structures were completely unprepared to manage. As Sir Gareth contemplated these developments during the quiet evening hours at Raven's Hollow Keep, he realized that the survival techniques that had defined his generation might prove to be merely the crude beginning of a transformation that would ultimately make traditional concepts of warfare, society, and human nature obsolete. The children being born represented not just enhanced versions of current human capabilities, but potentially an entirely new form of consciousness that would require completely different approaches to existence. The Knights of Valdris had succeeded in their goal of learning to survive brutal battles, but their success had triggered changes that extended far beyond survival into the realm of fundamental human evolution. They had opened doors to capabilities that their children would explore in ways that previous generations couldn't imagine, carrying humanity toward a future that would be shaped by consciousness abilities that transcended all previous understanding of human potential. Rest peacefully tonight, dear listener, knowing that the greatest survival achievement of all might be the courage to create possibilities for future generations that extend far beyond our own understanding, trusting that human consciousness will continue evolving toward greater capabilities and deeper wisdom in ways that honor both our struggles and our highest aspirations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.